Okay, so uh, I made this example and then I made a video recording that was about 40 minutes long, and then I went to test it, and then I realized that my mic was not working and it didn't record any audio. So I'm recording this again. So hopefully I can get it done in less than 40 minutes the second time through. But I want to show you, so there was a question that Johnny had about constraints, and his constraints, especially his gluing things together, was not working. So here is sort of an example that I just that I did, showing that it works. But there's some stuff that they changed from 16 to 17 that is not obvious. And so that's what this video is about, to explain how do you glue things together in Houdini 17, because they did make a few changes to things. And if you don't know, then it can be pretty confusing. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go in, I'm just going to show you over here just the simple models that I made. So over here I have a door. There's the door out. And then I took that door, so that's going to be the geometry for my door. And then over here, I just extruded it bigger, and I made another box that's going to be for the door frame. So I only extruded it in thickness so that it would go through this thicker door frame. Then I used a Boolean set to subtract. So I subtracted that out. And so over here, here's the door frame, and over here is the door. And so if I make a merge, and we just look at what our model is going to look like, it looks like that. Okay. And so that's all I did for modeling. So a really simple example. And then for the fractures, this is what it looks like over here. So I'm going to keep the nulls just to keep everything, but I'll delete everything else so we can go from scratch. That's what I get for not checking. My mic here at home is not great. Okay, so here I used an object merge, and I brought in the door, and I threw down some RBD paint, and I just painted that area there. And then over here I put into the material fracture, and for the primary fracture, and so I said scatter from attribute and gave it the attribute of density. I gave it the attribute of density because over here, that's what we're painting. So I'm painting on the density. And then over here, it uses that density attribute to create fractures. I increase the amount of points, and I just changed the seed. And then over here now, I can see that I have a lot more fractures in the area where I painted. And it does give me this density and visibility fall off. That's all in the geometry. So I can delete those. It's a good idea to delete unneeded attributes once they're not needed anymore. So there's an attribute delete. It can help keep your scene memory usage, like your RAM, low, so that the computer doesn't have to carry this on node after node. And then it's on the points, so I can come over here and just say, you can use the drop-down menu to select what you don't need. So now when I look, that color will be gone because that density visualization won't be there anymore. Now I want to export out the constraints. So if I make a null, and I have a null over here for the door constraints. So I have the door constraints over there, and where it says constraints here, the only thing I changed was I put down door glue, just so I knew which one, because I know I'm going to have multiple constraints over here. So I have that. And now this has the density and the visibility fall off as well. So I might want to just copy and make a copy of that and pipe it in here. Just again, that just gets rid of the coloring. And then for the name attribute, all I did was I turned on fracture namespace, and I typed in door, and that just means when it makes the fractures, if you look at the name attribute over here, the name attribute has the it says door, and then it says the piece number. So if I go through, you can see door, piece, fracture 19, subfracture 1. So it goes into that. On the attributes over here, now some things to keep in mind is, first of all, on the attributes, it has all these groups for like group for concrete, group door. Like we don't need these group nodes for the fractures. I don't know if you can hear that, but it sounds like my neighbor just decided to start drilling holes into their wall. So I apologize if you hear that over the microphone. Hopefully you don't hear it, but you might. So I'm going to just make a group delete just to clean up the geometry, just to minimize. And I say delete all these groups. Now, these attributes over here, they're putting stuff here for strength, for rest length. So the strength value over here, that's going to carry over when we go in to our, simulation. It's going to override, or not, I think it's going to multiply the value that you have here by the glue strength. So just keep that in mind. This becomes important later on. So I have that over there, group delete. There's my door constraints, they're out. And then over here, we have the door geometry over here. So that's cool. So then over here, for the door frame, what I wanted to do, just so we can see this, I set it to wood, just so it'll look more like wood. But if you just pipe this, something like this in, what the wood will do is, if you look at how the wood grain is forming, the long pieces, that makes sense for the wood grain to go up and down. But over here, I would rather have the wood grain be going like left to right rather than up and down. So all I did was I made a box and I put it, so I surrounded the kind of top part. And then if I come over here, I made a Boolean, but I set the Boolean to shatter, and it makes these cuts. And then over here on the RBD material fracture, I just turned on fracture per piece. And what that'll do is, since there's been a fracturing there, it'll look at this piece on its own, it looks at these pieces on their own, and it knows that these pieces are tall, and it knows that this piece is more long. So when it makes the wood, now the wood grain is going in this direction on the top, but on these bottom ones, it's going like up and down. So I think that's really cool. It's cool that they kind of thought about that. And then I also added the frame to the fracture over here. So I can see over there it says frame and then piece 0. And then there's a lot of the pieces that are clustered together. So over here under clustering, and what that does is that just fuses a lot of these pieces together. So the default setting is this. So if I drop down an exploded view, it's going to weld, it's going to weld a lot of these pieces together. So it looks like I only really have maybe like 7 pieces here. So if you want a little bit more pieces, or maybe something that looks maybe a little bit more interesting, we can have what is called random detachment. So under clustering, there's random detach. If I turn that on, then you can see we get a lot more pieces that are flying off. And that might look kind of cool. So I just had that exploded view just to check that. And so, and then in constraints, I just called it frame glue over there. So now I'm going to put the constraints over here for the frame constraint. And then for the geometry, I'll put that over there. Now for the geometry, I'll keep the groups because that can be useful for shading. But again, for the constraints, I have all this group stuff over here. I don't really need that. So I'm going to just I'm just going to copy this group delete and put it over here. So again, we have these attributes that are on our constraints. So now the next thing is we want to glue the door to the door frame. So that's the tricky part, and that's the part that Johnny had questions about because his constraints weren't holding together. So I want to just show you. Let's say you have a torus. Okay. And on the torus, I'm going to use an attribute create. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to make the name attribute. And I'm going to say, I'm going to put it on the primitives. And then the value, it's going to be a string. And I'll just call this Taurus $prim number. Okay, so over here, so if you say $PR, that stands for the primitive number. So here, I'm making each polygon is going to have its own name attribute. So when I come over here, and then if I say connect adjacent pieces, what's going to happen is, if I increase the search radius, and I'm going to increase the amount of connections. Let's template this. So what's happening is that it's sort of connecting to itself. And if I keep increasing this, it'll create more and more pieces. Which looks kind of interesting, looks kind of cool, but right now it's making connections in between itself, like on its own piece of geometry. So it's sort of like, okay, well, how does it know? How does it know to do that? And it's looking at the name attribute. And if you look at the connect adjacent pieces help card, it's really important. So if you come over here, it says the name primitive attribute is used to determine which primitives in the input geometry belong to each piece. So right now, it thinks that those polygons have their own piece, like they're all different pieces, which is confusing the hell out of this thing. Or if I had, say, a primitive or a torus over here, and I'll just give it the name attribute of torus, and then I'll make a box or a sphere. I'll make like a polygon sphere. And I'll give this a name attribute of sphere. And I'll merge them together. And then I'll make the connect adjacent pieces. And I'll increase the search radius. And then if I template that. So what's happening here is that, again, we're making those connections, and it knows that the sphere is one piece and the torus is another piece of geometry. And maybe if I move this out of the way, it might. So I'm going to take this and just lift it up. So what's happening here is that we're making these connections based on how close they are and everything. Like there's all these different settings for the search radius, for how long it needs to look for, and you can have as many different connections as you need. But it's connecting it there, and it knows that the sphere is different from the torus because it has different name attributes. So if it has a different name attribute, it knows, okay, that's a different piece. I'm going to connect these adjacent pieces to one another. But if I gave it the same name, so if this was called torus, and if I made the sphere, if I called the sphere torus, it's not going to connect because it knows that, oh yeah, it thinks these are the same pieces. It thinks that, let me just, sorry, my display is, oh, I see. Okay, sorry. So over here, it thinks right now that this is the same piece, that the sphere and the torus, it thinks it's the same piece because they have the same name attribute all for every individual primitive. But if I come over here and if I just change it to like blah, 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 so it has a different name, now there's going to be those connections. Okay, so we're going to use this as like how to kind of trick the computer over here. So over here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to find our geometry. So here's the door geometry, and here's the frame geometry. And I'm eventually going to merge these together. And then I'm going to run a connect adjacent pieces on them. But right now it's not doing what I want, because right now they all have different unique names for the different pieces. So if they all have different unique names, they're all just, it's all going crazy. It's too many connections. I really just want the door and the door frame to be connected. I don't want it to like connect with itself. And that's what it's doing, because all the different fractures have different names. So what I'm going to do to simplify this, first off, I need to store the name attribute. It's really important, that name attribute. So if I come over here and if I look at over here, there's that name attribute. So we stored it in, make a wrangle. So if I go on the primitive and if I say make a new attribute, make a new string attribute called original name, and store that in the attribute, or that is coming from the attribute name, then that should just be a direct copy. It's just basically copying the information from one side to the other. Okay, so it's just copying it. And we have OG name. And then the name attribute over here, I'm just going to overwrite that. So I'm just going to go over here and say, and make name equal to, sorry, my wife is texting me. Just 1 second. Okay, sorry. So, and then I'm just going to give everything here the same name attribute. So it just thinks this is one solid piece. So I'll just call it Geo1. So I can see over there now, it's all called Geo1. And then over here, same thing, except I'll call it Geo2. So now if I come over here and I look, now the connect adjacent pieces is going to give me all the glue pieces. That's awesome. I don't, however, I don't need all the groups. I can see that there's all these group things. So, because I know this is going to be for, because this is constraints, it's not the geometry. So anymore, this is going to be for a constraint. So I can come over here and make a group delete. And just say star. And then copy the same thing. Put it over here. It just keeps it a bit cleaner. So when I look over here, okay, so now here's something that's, this is the problem, or this was like the big problem that we ran into. And because I wasn't going, when I was looking at Johnny's work, I wasn't going into the attribute spreadsheet too much, or if I wasn't paying close attention. What I need to do now is I need to copy the original name, the OG name, back over here into the name attribute, because it's important that these pieces know what geometry they're supposed to be attached to. But I can see over here that is lost. I don't see it anymore. And so something is happening inside the connect adjacent pieces, and this used to work. It used to be that the OG name would be there, but now it's not there anymore. So we need to fix this. And the cool thing is that this node in here, this is going to be this is like an asset. You can see the little lock. We can go inside and we can actually, it's just made up of other nodes. If I go inside here, it's all grayed out, but it's just other nodes. And you can kind of walk through and you can sort of see what this does. I'm not going to go through all that. We don't need to do that. But what I'm going to do is if I go up here and I right click, I can say allow editing of contents. And now it's unlocked, so now I can go inside. And the first thing, right at the very top, it says remove all attributes. So if I come over here and I look, well, this had the attribute, this had the OG name. And so in the first node, it deletes it. Over here, it says it's deleting all the attributes except for the name. Well, how about except for the name and except for OG name? So now that'll be there. And then over here, it's transferring the name attribute to the points. Okay, well, how about transfer the OG name to the points as well? So over here, I'm just going to say name and OG name. So there it is there. And if I go all the way to the bottom, that's actually the only thing we had to do. If I go all the way to the bottom over here, now we have our glue, and we'll have name, and we'll have OG name over here. So that's awesome. So now all I need to do is I need to go to the original name and copy it back to the attribute for the name attribute, because the name attribute is kind of special. That's what the simulation is looking for, so it knows what pieces of glue belong to which piece of geometry. So I just need to go from here and put it over there. So for that, I'm going to delete this name attribute. So I can go to attribute delete. And then I'm going to delete the name attribute. And then there's an attribute rename. And I can come over here and I can say rename OG name to name. So now we're back. Now we're in business, because now this is going to connect it to the correct piece of geometry. So we're good. So now I can go over here and put that into the connection glue. And now I can go over and I can take all the constraints. So here's the connection glue. Oh yeah, and I also have to give it the constraint name over here on the primitives to be part of the simulation. So if I make another wrangle and put this on primitives, it's a string attribute called constraint name. That's going to be equal to connected glue. So we're good for that. That's awesome. And then now that's over here. And then over here, I'm going to take the connection glue, the door constraint, and the frame constraint. They're all going to be merged together over here. And then that's going to go over here into all glue. It's going to go out from there. Now for the geometry, we're pretty good, except the fact we have to pack it. So I'm going to make an assemble. Pack it. I'm not going to create a new name attribute because we spent all that time trying to get the name attribute right, and I was just going to overwrite it with like piece 0, piece 1. So I say don't create the name attribute. I want to have like the door, like everything kind of unique. And then I'll copy that and I'll put it over onto the frame geometry over here. But the thing is that this geometry is now packed, and you can't really edit the packed geometry. You can sometimes apply attributes to them, but you can't really edit them. When I come over here to the connect adjacent pieces, now I don't have glue anymore because the geometry is packed. So I'm just going to put these kind of off to the side, and then above the assemble, I'm just going to connect that directly down over here. So it bypasses the packing process. Same thing with this one over here. And so now that goes back into the things that made my glue. And so now I have the connection for the glue there. So now we're pretty much ready to go. So if I go back now, if I go into the sim, now I connected everything to the same null nodes. So everything should be working still. So I'm just going to come over here. I'm going to just disconnect things. Oops. And I'm going to shake loose the constraints. And I'm going to get rid of this sphere for now. And I'll just actually go one by one. So if I come over here into the door frame, I want to see, does that work? Okay, that crumbles. That's good. I'm going to bring in that and the door frame. Okay, that's working. That's good. So once we know that the sim is working, I'm going to bring in the constraints. So I'm going to drop in the constraint network. I have the constraint network here. It's wired into all glue. I had this from before when I was making the recording and it didn't capture the audio. So I just had to go in here and just make sure I was bringing that in. So the fracture is the all glue. And then I'm just going to start with the door glue. Undo. Yeah. And then I'm just going to break that, connect that over there. So I can see there's the door glue over there if I hit play. So there's the door. It looks like I'll have to make one of these pieces inactive. That's fine. And then if I come over here to the door frame, I can see there's the symbol for the door frame. And so those pieces are breaking apart. Again, I'll have to make a piece inactive to kind of hold it at the top level there, but I can see that's working. So that's great. And now the connection glue, I'm going to bring that in. I colored it green. You can just come over here under guides and color it green. And now if I come here and I hit play, it totally, almost completely deletes right away. And this was the problem that Johnny was having, was that a lot of times there was like no connection there as soon as it would play, or if it did play, sometimes these would stretch and it would get all weird. So let's see what's happening here. So if I come around and if I go down, what you can do in DOPS, it's a bit hidden, but if you go to relationships and you go to find your constraint network, and then if you go down to, there's another thing here, it says constraint network. If you go inside there, you can find the geometry. And you'll find that there's going to be lots of the glue, all the glue that we have as the connected glue. You'll find that that has a strength of 0, and that all has a strength of 0 all the way down, and that's going to cause you a lot of problems. Like it's like it's breaking as soon as the simulation starts. And I was like, why does this have a strength of 0? Because I could see over here, I put in like 100, or I could put in like 10,000, and it still has a strength of 0. So like, what the hell's going on? And what's happening is that if we go back to our fractures or our constraints, what happened is over here, if I look at these constraints, this has strength, the strength attribute. If I come over here, this has the strength attribute. And the one that I made, though, does not have the strength attribute. And when they all get connected together, you get this little warning sign, and it says, hey, there's a mismatch. Like you have some constraint, you have some attributes, and then some of them don't have the same attribute. And so what happens is, if it doesn't have an attribute, like these ones had like numbers for strength, for like the frame and for the door. But over here, the connection, it gave it a default value of 0. And so what's happening is as soon as it goes into the sim, these are going to have a value of 0, and it's not going to work. So the easiest thing to do is to just give it your own default value. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say make a float attribute called strength. Make sure you spell it right. I'll just give it a value of 1. So now it has a strength value of 1. So what's going to happen now is when I go back into my DOPNet over here and I hit play, now that glue is going to hold together. You can see there that only when it falls is there enough force to cause it to break. I believe it takes whatever value you have here for strength and it will multiply it. So because this is a value of 1, and I come over here, it's going to have a strength of 10,000. But if it has a strength value of 0, that's going to bring it down to 0, and that's why it deleted right away. So that's still a bit strong, so I could maybe take it down to 100 or so, and it breaks pretty quickly just the same. So maybe 1,000, or I could even keep it at what it was. Okay, so that's cool. So I just need to make a piece not active. So if I come back over here, I'll go over to like my door frame, and over here, here's my frame geometry. So I'll just try to organize this a bit. I just want to take this out of the way. And if I come over here to the door geometry over here, or the frame geometry, I can go over here and I'm just going to grab, oh, you son of a gun. Come on. I'm going to grab that piece. And for some reason for this, maybe because it's packed or something, when I do it says that nothing is selected, even though I clearly had something selected there. And then when I select it again, it shows me the points. I'm not sure exactly what's going on here, but now if I do it, now it'll work basically. So now if I select that piece, make a wrangle, and I don't need all these. I think I just grab one, and that's on points. And then I'm going to say make a integer attribute called active. Make that equal to 0. And then before that, I'm just basically going to copy that. Come on. Just drop it in there. And then I'm going to get rid of the groups and then set the active value to 1. So it applies to all of them. So if I come over here and I look, they'll all have a value of 1, except there should be one with a value of 0. So now if I go back into my sim, that one value should be holding everything up, which I can see. So now I'm going to go in and I'm going to activate the sphere that I had over here. And did I delete the, oh. Let's go over here and sphere out. So there it is there. And then if I hit play, there I can see there's my sim working the way, hopefully the way that we want it to work. So now everything is glued together, but now we have things, interesting things where, you know, part of the roof is, or the part of the frame is breaking, but then there's glue holding things together. And you can play around and get some really interesting looking things. You can also, don't forget, you can add that soft constraint as well. So hopefully this makes sense. And I do apologize. I should have went through this in Houdini 17, but it's so new. I just hadn't had the time to go through all this. So there are quite a few little things you have to watch out for, but the main thing is in the fractures, when we go in and we combine them to make the in-between glue, it didn't keep a lot of the information there that we needed it to have. So in this case, now over here, now we have the correct name attribute. Before it was deleting that OG name, which we need to keep because we need to know what original piece of geometry this is supposed to be held on to. Okay, so if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I will include this project file, but please don't just copy and paste, just use it for reference. And best of luck with your assignments. Hey, I finished it faster than 40 minutes.